Welcome back to the Rethink. This is the second installment in Neon Galactic's ongoing conversation with bright minds and forward thinkers involved in the UFO, UAP, and HI subject, including all the related questions and dilemmas that arise out of its study. I'm your host, James Full. This time, we're again joined by co-host Dr. Chris Avis from Camosun College in Canada, as well as philosophy professor Michael Zimmerman from the University of Colorado at Boulder, science Bob McGwier, a scientist and inventor who has a long history as a contractor with the U.S. government, Matthew Roberts, author, experiencer, and former Navy cryptologist, and Kelly Chase, experiencer, podcaster, and producer with the UFO Rabbit Hole podcast and Ontocalypse Productions. For those who've been following this topic, it's clear that we've entered a transformative moment in the conversation. The man perhaps most responsible for its explosion in popular consciousness over these past 7 years has just released his new book, Imminent, and it promises to unmask his thoughts on the topic as well as his experiences while leading the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or ATIP. The skeptics and U.S. defense establishment have already launched a quiet campaign of ridicule and doubt, putting Elizondo's livelihood and perhaps even his safety at risk. Yet given the attention his book has drawn and will continue to draw, the subject seems poised to break wide open, offering millions of new folks the skinny on what the government knows about UFOs and what it all means. How do we maximize this opportunity? How should we publicly discuss what may be a challenging change in the way people understand reality, the universe, even their own minds? Is this a form of soft disclosure? We'll discuss as many of these issues as we can in our 2-hour time frame, and also explore how each of our guests have themselves been impacted by anomalous experiences and the aftermath that inevitably follows. Thanks for joining us. Please enjoy. To sort of start the conversation by focusing on the fact that, as with Diana Pasulka's work, one of the things that she revealed through her work is that the people that are having anomalous experiences are some of the most brilliant minds and productive people you could imagine. And that lent a serious credibility to the topic that I think for a lot of folks, myself included, lacked credibility prior to that. So I wanted to do a sort of a quick round with folks and have you sort of introduce yourselves as much as you want to say about who you are and why you're involved in this topic, and then talk about some of the more formative or one of the more formative anomalous experiences you've had that helped, bring you into the UFO fold. So Kelly Chase, thank you for joining us, and thank you for all the work that you've done with the podcast and documentary that's upcoming on Ontocalypse Productions. And we'll start with you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. So my name is Kelly Chase. I'm the host of the UFO Rabbit Hole podcast. And as James mentioned, I'm also working on a docuseries, The Beyond UFOs in a New Reality, that I am writing and executive producing along with my company, Ontocalypse Productions, and that should be out in a couple of months. It's wild to me in a lot of ways that I'm even here. I just about 3 years ago had an anomalous experience that changed my life and that kind of brought me into this topic. Up to that point, I had literally no interest in this topic whatsoever. I was kind of a strict atheist. I was very anti-woo. And then something happened to me that kind of turned all of that on its head. It's hard to explain exactly what happened, and it doesn't necessarily fit like smoothly into the UFO narrative all the time. If people are interested in hearing what happened to me, there's an episode of my podcast called Through the Looking Glass that goes into all of that. I find that it's really hard sometimes to talk about these experiences that go so far outside of our kind of everyday language and conversation that, I don't want to take up a ton of time here trying to put words to things that are very hard to explain. But, needless to say, it changed my life and the entire trajectory of my life. And this work is basically what I do now from the time I wake up till the time I go to bed. And but I have never been happier, and I'm really enjoying this. I can't get enough of this topic because I know so many other people feel the same way, and I'm really excited to be here with all of you to have this conversation today. I think these conversations are really important, and I know for all of us weirdos out there who might not always have people in our day-to-day lives to have these conversations with, how valuable these conversations can be. So thank you guys so much for setting this up and having us all here today.
Thank you, Kelly. Matthew, you've written a book about your experiences, and it's a lovely book. I've had you interviewed on the show a couple of times, and both of those are some of my favorite conversations. So thank you for that. But if you don't mind giving some people a sort of a sense of how you might describe your encounters with the anomalous, and also, a little bit of your background so people can understand who and where you're coming from.
Thanks, James. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I would describe my experiences with the anomalous as completely life-changing. That's why it's so important that we talk about these things so that people understand that these experiences in fact are not anomalous, right? They happen to people every day, all day long, and they're very normal. And it's normal to have very human reactions to those things. So I think that conversation is incredibly important. Because it strikes at the heart of what it means to be human, and we all need to understand what that means, what it means to be human. So a little bit about myself. I was on the USS Theodore Roosevelt during the gimbal event. I was a cryptologist on board, so I was kind of privy to things that were going on. I then afterwards, after the gimbal event, I transferred to the Office of Naval Intelligence, where I worked as an analyst for 3 years and ultimately ended my naval career there. Because of the gravity of the things that had happened to me. And I felt it was important that, I be as honest as possible and write this book so that people who are experiencing the same kinds of things could know that they aren't going crazy and they're not losing their minds.
We'll put a link to your book in the description for this video so that people can get a copy of it if they like. I highly, highly recommend it. It's a fascinating journey, both through your anomalous experiences, but then also through your philosophical search to sort of make sense of it and where you arrive at through that. And I think it's a very powerful story. So thanks for that. Professor Michael Zimmerman, you did us the favor about a week ago or 2 weeks ago of sending us out a list sort of the anomalous experiences that your family has had. And then you mentioned yourself a dream that had occurred to you prior that maybe you'd sort of gotten lost in your memory, but then it resurfaced and maybe it meant something more. But can you talk a little bit about your family's anomalous experiences and also your long and storied history in this topic? I mean, from working with John Mack and having formative discussions back, those 2 decades ago or whatever it was up until now, you've been very active. Yeah. So, can you introduce yourself and tell us about your family's experiences?
Thank you, James. I love your podcast, and all of you have been doing great stuff. And it is. I just got through yesterday with the Society for UAP Studies. They had a 3-day online workshop, and this type of thing would have been impossible 10 years ago. We owe it all to the 2017 New York Times stories, and I've been having an interest in this topic for many years. I was born in, now, when I go into a room now, I'm always the oldest person. Right? I was born in 1946. That is, 1945, the atomic bomb goes off. I'm born. The next year, we had the big UFO sighting in near Mount Rainier by, what's his name? Tell me, the pilot.
Kenneth Arnold.
Kenneth Arnold, yeah.
So I'm kind of bookended by those events. And those things are related somehow, the atomic bomb, nuclear energy, nuclear weapons especially, and UFOs and so on. But my introduction to this topic, then I'll talk just for a moment about my family, another aspect of my family. And I must have been in what would have been 57, 5 years after the famous overflight 2 weekends in a row of Washington, D.C. by flotillas of UFOs. There was like a 5-year retrospective newspaper story about it. Now, I had never heard of this, and I didn't really know anything about UFOs. But I said, wow, that's pretty amazing. So I went in to see my dad. Now, this is the first adult conversation I had with him, in the sense of an actual conversation. I must have been about 11 or something, or 12. And I said, Dad, what do you make of this? and they make of it in the sense of, was this explanation given to explain away the event at the largest press conference since World War II, since everyone was fired up about this, that it was some kind of a temperature inversion which caused headlights to project into the night sky. And that was it, folks. Nothing else to see here. And now he was working on his PhD dissertation at MIT in 1941 when December 7th happened. So he dropped out in order to contribute to the war effort. He had a heart murmur, so he couldn't join up. So he was technically trained, and I wouldn't say he just scoffed at that interpretation, but he made it clear that something really had happened, and that this way of accounting for it was not adequate. So that in my childhood, this was like a permission. And so as UFO stories showed up over the years, I was interested. And then in the 80s, especially, and then this experience of seeing the cover of Communion, that was just a shocking, that to me was almost paranormal itself. But, so I got to work, it was such a privilege working with John Mack for a decade or so on this stuff. And then around just a few years ago, when I'm starting to work on a book about all this, I said, I ought to check with my family about this. Who else has had one? Because my brother around the year 2000 confided in me. He knew I'd been working with John Mack. He's about 10 years older, died a few years ago from cancer. But he's had apparently an abduction experience in the mountains outside California, outside of Los Angeles, San Gabriel Mountains. I gave a whole account of it. He doesn't remember the experience itself on board, assuming he went up there. But then when he was telling me the story, the hair is standing up on his forearms. So shocking was it. My sister said years later that it just devastated him and it changed his life, and not for the good, because it was a negative experience. So I said, I better check with some other siblings just in case, because this stuff happens in families, right? And I don't know if it means my attraction to the Communion cover says that, I'd seen that critter, but I don't recall anything like that. But I turned out that the three other siblings, and my sister and my brother, the brother ended up with a PhD in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech. My family's educated. And they both spoke about this massive light coming through their window in the middle of the night, incomprehensible, like a solid block of light, a white light coming in, and it was just absolutely terrifying to both of them. So of course they immediately decided to go to sleep, or got to sleep as soon as they could. Typical reaction, I think, to some of these things. And then my brother is another brother about 15 years younger. He and his wife are driving along the road one evening, going to a party in Baton Rouge, near Baton Rouge. He starts spotting this light to his left, kind of tracking the car, and he realizes that it's not a plane, blah, blah, blah. He has a PhD too. He said, well, that's probably a UFO. Now, he didn't really say anything. His wife didn't want to disturb her, but they turned off the road, and there was about a quarter of a mile or so drive up to the house where they were going in the country. And this light then came and sat right in front of him, about 300 yards away, as if blocking his path to the house. And he stops, and he's staring at this and says, Jennifer, do you see that? Didn't see it. This is an example of the selectivity of the phenomenon, which has its own point of view about who's going to get to see it. Anyway, this is a huge event for him. He had never really talked about it, and he didn't have anywhere to put it. So I haven't had I've never had a UFO sighting. I did have this incredible dream in London back in 1980 with these 3 or 4 big birds coming in the window. It was so intense and colorful. And at the time, I knew nothing of screen memories or aliens or abductions or anything. And I talked to some people about it, just emphasizing how bizarre and intense it was. Today, if that were to happen to me today, I would have a different interpretation of what might have happened. let me just conclude with this. I'm a philosopher. I think it's deeply regrettable that for decades and decades, philosophers have stayed away from this, as have many, many other academics, a kind of self-censure. This phenomenon, I just call it the phenomenon, everything from Bigfoot to fairies, I think it's part of the same stretch of strangeness. It's not the same, but it shows that our world and our experience of the world is populated by all sorts of strange critters that have been with us from the get-go. And people from all times and places have spoken about these things. And it's time that they get brought back onto the table for discussion without ridicule or shame. These are aspects of reality as we human beings experience it. And I can't imagine today a more important topic to address. So that's
And then Science Bob McGwier. I wanted to tell you, though, by the way, when you came on the show, Headline Humboldt, my other daytime news show, you and Ralph Blumenthal, that show became one of my most viewed shows ever. So thank you for that. Everyone loved your sense of humor and charm. So I thought I'd pass that along. Right. But before the show started, you shared some of your anomalous experiences with us. Can you give us an introduction of yourself and how those experiences shaped you?
I was on the faculty at Virginia Tech, where I was the chief scientist for the best funded research center at Virginia Tech. So I was the chief scientist. And that had nothing to do with UFOs, except I was still connected with my classified brethren because we did national security research for the US government. And I kept hearing stuff and occasionally seeing stuff that they had, including photos of UAP. So I began looking into it, read Richard Dolan's National Security State and all that, and decided that I would go out and find a person that I could almost surely see a UFO with. And Chris Bledsoe was an hour and a half away from me, from Blacksburg, Virginia, to where he is in North Carolina. So I wrote him and said, look, I'm a scientist over here at Virginia Tech. I see you have scientists and government people around you all the time. Here's my credentials. I'd like to come and visit you. And he waited 3 weeks and invited me to come over. And when I got over there, he told me that Jim Zimmerman told him to let me in, that it ought to be interesting. So it was interesting because he and I talked for 3 days. The weather was too bad to go outside. And Chris is an open book. He literally told me every secret that I've heard him ever express. And being a person with a nearly photographic memory, it became filed away. So he just told me everything. It was amazing. So we finally went outside when he says, okay, it's clear and let's go. I think they're here. So we went outside and looked around and saw these flash bulbs going off in the trees in the sky, which was weird. And then these gigantic 40-foot orbs flew across the sky right above the trees. And there was this purple wavy haze that looked like the surface of a pond with wind blowing over it, except it was purple. And so stuff had been going on for 40 minutes. And all of a sudden I looked up and the purple stuff vanished. And he was not looking up because I turned around and looked at him and started to say, did you see it leave? And he said, before I could open my mouth, they're gone. They won't be back. We can go inside. And it was just the clearest evidence I had that he had some kind of telepathic connection with them. So I left there, went home, and 2 things happened. I had experiences at home, orbs and craft, and other things that led to things which I will explain later, but at the same time, my memories began to return. And I reached out to family and talked to them about the memories, including memories of being able to read miraculously when I was 3 years old. And I found out that it was 2 years after I had survived 3 cardiac arrests when I was 1 year old with a brain infection that they told me told my parents I would never recover from. And I think I would call them 3 NDEs since there were cardiac arrests, but I don't remember them as NDEs. So we moved, and then from then on until I was well into adulthood, I was all of a sudden able to do all sorts of technical things with no actual training. And so that led into my adult life as training to be a scientist, engineer, and mathematician, in which I would know something and not know how I knew it. And that led to my publications, and I started 2 companies, Federated Wireless, which is a wireless communications company, and Hawkeye 360, which is now a well-known geospatial intelligence company. It's the first commercial company to have its satellites adopted by the National Reconnaissance Office for the National Constellation. So everything about those things, including all the ideas that were in the patents that led to those companies, came in downloads. And I had to find other people who would help me flesh it out so we could turn it into something, because I had inadequate training to actually bring it to fruition. Okay, so then I remembered that at 18 years old, I went off to college with my girlfriend from my hometown, and we had an hour and a half of missing time. And I was going to be a doctor, but 2 weeks later, I left that school and went someplace and became a mathematician and an engineer. Just literally overnight, shocking everybody. And so that became my career. And then after Chris, I went with Chris Bledsoe to a UFO conference where he gave his first public talk, showing off his evidence in slide form, and I helped him write it. And I met Dave Scott, who offered me a role on Spaced Out Radio and gave me the name Science Bob. So it's stuck. And then later at the end of 2020, when it became clear that COVID was going to take over the world and my university would not open again for over a year, I retired. And I began having orbs in my home, craft in the sky, flying triangles in my front yard. And I met Lala online, and she read my mother and said she was going to be deceased soon, and if I wanted to, I could come and talk to her about it. So my mother passed, funeral over and all of that. I came back and talked to Lala about my mother, and it became clear within 15 or 20 minutes that it was impossible for her to know the things she knew that only my mother and I knew, for example, any other way that she was actually talking to her. And as the last case in this, she said, there's a little lady here. I can't understand her. Her Southern accent is so thick, I can barely make out any words she's saying, but she's jumping up and down, kept saying a word over and over again. And I'm almost embarrassed to say it because I don't know what it means. And I said, what's that? And she says, she keeps saying Tweety, Tweety. And when I was 1, my grandmother would keep me. She would call me Sweetie. I couldn't say the word Sweetie, so her name became Tweety. And at the end of that, you just know, wow, all of this stuff that you spent a lifetime denying, paranormal, supernatural, afterlife, etc., you've been in denial. And memories just kept flooding back of all sorts of things that happened, including, and I won't go into it here because I've gone over long, but an amazing spiritual experience I had in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre when I was doing an intelligence operation in Jerusalem. It was just unreal. But anyway, so I'm now Science Bob. Now I guess I'll be doing this forever. And Lala and I have non-stop stuff happen, including a bulbous, gray-headed, 6-foot-tall entity walk right up on us in our backyard and tell us what our job was. So there you go. And we got a picture of it.
Well, I want to see that.
Yeah, I'm happy to share it because I share it everywhere. But it's a clear-cut, gray bulbous head in this foggy-looking stuff 6 feet in front of us, and it told us what our job was, which was to get on helping with soft disclosure. And my background is the USS Blue Ridge in 2008. When we were going through a typhoon after leaving the Philippines on our way to Yokosuka, Japan, and this thing came over us in the middle of the typhoon, and I got curious because I could see it was lit up, but I couldn't see any rain, and we were in the middle of a typhoon. So I looked up and saw it. It took off straight up, and the rain returned, And that was weird.
Well, thank you for that. That was you sort of fit right in with the whole Pasulka crowd in terms of downloads and knowledge that seems to come from some other sphere that you have to kind of wrestle with and bring to fruition here. And these high achievements seem to be coming, at least partially, with fuel from somewhere else.
I'm not going to out them because they haven't already said this, but some really, really, really famous scientists, you can guess, in this area have told me most of their ideas came in downloads.
So, Chris, real quick, let's talk to you about your past experience. I mean, I understand that you haven't had any UFO encounters, but you did ketamine, and that opened your eyes to perhaps a more organic universe with lots of possibilities. And then also after that, I wanted to sort of talk to you about the Elizondo book that you seem to get an early copy of. But if you could introduce yourself and talk a little about your experience.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been on the show a few times, so I'll do the Coles Notes version. I've had a long-standing interest in the phenomena. I can remember going back to like 7th or 8th grade and doing public speaking talks, talking about the different classes of encounters, close encounters. But it had always been kind of locked away in my brain in this kind of fantasy land. This kind of wouldn't it be cool if it was true, but it's not kind of part. People talk about certain years where they become awoken to this. A lot of people will talk about 2017 with the New York Times. I think I've heard Kelly talk about 2021 for her. For me, it was 2023. And I was doing some psychedelic therapy and had experiences using ketamine for therapy, where I just encountered something that suddenly made the reality of what people would speak of with things like encounters of the divine feel very real to me in a way that I could not deny. And that was one piece that made me just suddenly go, oh crap, no, this is not fantasy. There's a reality to this, a real felt sense of it. And it's one of the things that makes me wonder, how do we really induce that or produce that for people, that because I couldn't really fully take this on until I'd had that personal experience. It was just I couldn't grok it. The second piece that happened in that year, around about the same time, was David Grush coming out and seeing the reality of that, seeing the pushback on the Schumer-Rounds amendment, suddenly made it incredibly real. Bryce Zabel talks about not disclosure, but confirmation. For me, that was confirmation. I could no longer deny that this was real. There was just too much evidence for me. And so it's kind of led me down this now rabbit hole where, frankly, the nuts and bolts portion of the thing, which is ironically most aligned with my teaching area of physics, is less interesting to me than what it tells us about our reality and the, say, metaphysics of the thing. So I'm feeling a little bit like an amateur here because I'm kind of delving into philosophy and history, religious studies and spirituality. And it's this insatiable hunger that kind of gets woken up in many of us that dip our toes into this. Before I get into Lou's book, I'm going to say that one of the things I think that I'd hoped with this second Rethink is that we could really lean into the experiencer side of things. And I'm hearing everyone's introduction that coming through loud and clear. I think that's great. The UFO crowd will talk a lot about the Lucy and the football moments where we seem like we're going to have this thing come from the government that's finally going to break it through, and then it just doesn't happen. But there's all this untapped power of people that I think have these experiences far more frequently than we realize. And so I really appreciate hearing both Matthew and Michael talking about the fact that this is a very normal thing. It's things that have been happening to humans, not just in our society in recent times, but for thousands of years. And I'm hoping that with the the added publicity around Lou's book, that we can really start to empower people to come forward, everyday folks, and share their stories. So I'm facilitating and moderating some of the chat. We'll bringing in some audience questions in the chat. But one of the things I'm actually going to put out there right now is, I know from our last time on the Rethink, we had some audience members that had their own experiences. And James and I have chatted about this, and we wanted to kind of extend a welcome to anyone that has had a personal experience and would like a platform to share about it, we would welcome you on the show. And so if that's you, feel free to reach out to me. I'll post my email in the chat. But I'd just love to hear from everyday folks and their experiences, because I think it's going to really help normalize it. And that is, I think, the disclosure that all of us can kind of own and really take this back from the government. So yeah, that's my little spiel. And yes, on the note of the chat, we will be taking audience questions as well where we can find time. So feel free to fire those off to us, and we'll try to find some space to fire them at our participants.
So thank you for that, and thank you for mentioning the experiencer piece. And that's exactly why I wanted to talk about this so long in the beginning, because I think that helps locate all of us and our sort of investment in the conversation. We're not, I mean, maybe I am, I guess, sort of academically looking at this, but I've had my own experiences through meditation and other things that have opened my eyes as well. So I'd like people to encourage people to follow through on what Chris suggested by sharing your stories. And I do want to talk about Lou's book, because that's the moment we're in. And it's such a different time and place than it would have been 5 years ago or 10 years ago, where we can have these basically societal conversations about UFOs and secret programs within the government. And it's not all just dismissed as sort of a rambling conspiracy theory. So, but Chris, you managed to get a hold of a copy, and you said you were going to peruse it, and we all kind of perused the preview. I think I can say that that was released on the internet. But what were your thoughts on it? And if you can give me a sort of a brief idea of how you think that this might impact the conversation, and then we'll move on to some other folks for their take on that.
Yeah, so the initial surprise for me, and it's funny, despite going on a show like this, as I walk into the bookstore, I'm still feeling that stigma of I'm going to have to go up to the front desk and ask about the UFO book, and I'm kind of going like, where do you keep the crazy books? But I ask, and of course, I'm not expecting this to be at the front of the store on prominent display, but it is, and there's a lot of copies there. So that to me is the first thing that has changed. This is, I think, the most significant in terms of press UAP book that we've seen come out in a good number of years. So that has immediately changed the conversation. You're seeing Luis Elizondo on CBS mornings there. So
yeah,
and that to me is going to be, I think, the most interesting thing about this book. For those that in the community that are going to be receiving it in the coming days, what I'm going to say is that I think this has been hyped for probably 6 months since its release date was announced, and I think a lot of people are going in expecting massive bombshells and such to come out. The striking thing is that there's not massive amounts of information in the book that you haven't heard from Lou himself, nor haven't heard elsewhere in the community. But what it is, again, is confirmation. Like, you are seeing things talked about in this book around remote viewing, around implants and their difficulty in extracting them, around even topics as obscure as the Collins Elite, which, as far as I know, have only really been kind of published in Nick Redfern's books, which are quite a bit smaller scale and less well known here. And yet this is coming out in a publication from it's from HarperCollins, I believe, a really big mainstream publisher that is really pushing this. So I think the community, if they're expecting bombshells about what the phenomenon is, they may be disappointed. But the significance of this moment, that this is coming out in a way that the general public might see it, is going to be really interesting. And so I'm actually more interested in the reaction in the press to the book than really the book itself. The other piece I think that the UAP community will find interesting, because there is a lot of, I think, discussion about Lou's motivations and what he's been doing and the kind of 4D chess that's being played behind the scenes. He goes into quite a bit of detail about why he's had challenges in getting government officials to take this seriously. And I think that'll clarify a good chunk of his background. And he's done some quite interesting things in the book. For instance, I don't know if you can see it, there's large portions of the book that are redacted because he went through the DOPSR authorization process to have this released, and he's quite transparent about the process in that book. So trying to draw the public eye around what he can and can't talk to. So I think it is quite helpful for the public to still understand where there is kind of censoring or redaction happening. So we're going to see what happens in the coming weeks, and I'm really hoping that we can build the positive momentum with this book. We've got part 3 of God's Man in War coming out in early September. Of course, we've got Kelly's The Beyond documentary, which I'm eagerly awaiting, and James Fox's new documentary. There's a lot of momentum building, and it seemingly is all building up to this second iteration of the Rounds Schumer Amendment. And I have to say, the UFO community really stepped up in pressing our representatives. We need to see if we can capitalize on this. It's going to be a slow burn, but I'm really hopeful this will plant a good seed for us.
I want to add,
Kelly,
people need to pay attention to the context in the books of where it's redacted. Look at everything around it, because that'll give you some indication of what's under it. I think it was a brilliant move on Lou's part.
Completely.
Kelly, I'd like to get your take on how this, how Lou's book might impact the conversation. Like Chris mentioned, you are in the process of producing and editing a documentary, The Beyond, UFOs and a New Reality. I got to see a little bit of a preview at Contact in the Desert, and I thought it was brilliantly done and it's just going to be an important work, I think, and I appreciate your hard work in that regard. But one of the things I've noticed as we've been discussing Lou's book is that skeptics were right out of the gate with the preview that came out, and they're like, aha, remote viewing, and there's orbs in his house. He's a lunatic, and we can't take him seriously. And I'm wondering, I mean, we're sort of now going to be forced, I think, to have this conversation that involves a little bit of the woo that some people want to avoid. Do you think the time is right for that? How should we react to that as members of this community? And what can we expect?
Oh boy, yeah. Yeah, I was surprised. I will say that I'm surprised that Lou decided to go as far as he did in the book. I've only read excerpts, but from what I've seen and what I've seen online, he certainly carries the ball much further down the field than I would have expected, especially given like the sort of conservative approach that he's had in the past.
Yeah.
I wonder what that 4D chess looks like progressed down the the next few months. Like, what is that? Is there a greater plan coming? I sometimes I hesitate to say these things because I feel like if you even voice them at all, it's like somehow like an attack on Luis Elizondo, and I don't intend it in any this way at all. But I do have questions about if this does get more traction within the mainstream media. Are they ready to take that leap? Are they ready to talk about, showing up as light beings and, remote viewing and Nordics? And I mean, I'm very excited to have those conversations. And I think that if we're not talking about the holistic phenomenon, we're not really talking about the phenomenon. At the same time, I don't know where we go from here, and I don't know how the media is going to react to this thing and how it's going to come out. I also think that it's really interesting that he chose to disclose some of his own personal background, specifically around, his work at Guantanamo Bay. And, I think that in this community where we feel like we've really gotten to see who Luis Elizondo is over these last few years, and, he's been such a hero for this community that people are really kind of willing to give him the benefit of the doubt on that and give him a pass without really having any details about what that actually involved. I don't think that the mainstream media, if they get into the story at all, is going to be as willing to just sort of like, well, he was doing his job. You know what I mean? Like, I think that we need to think about what this looks like to the broader community. And I think it'll be very interesting. I'm just interested to see how it all turns out. I'm a little apprehensive, if I'm being honest, about where all this is headed and how it's going to ultimately be received by the media. But I'm wishing him only the best in this endeavor, and I hope it goes really well. And I hope that there is a larger game going on in the background that I'm just not seeing, and that my fears are unfounded. But I would be lying if I said I didn't have them.
Those are all great points. I think that we often in this community set up people as heroes, or we want to sort of see them as, the champion of our cause. And we got to be careful about the cult of personality where we invest all of this energy and hope into one person, because any one person can be taken down. They can have problems and skeletons in their past, any of that. And if we, put all of our eggs in that basket, they might well get smashed. But one of the things that the remote viewing aspect that got brought up, it's like, I feel like there's a piece where maybe we can begin to rally around some of that, where I think, and I'm going to have Dean Radin on my show this week to talk a little bit about it, but I think psi has been proven. I think that you can make a coherent and complete argument that there is evidence that basically would prove psi if it were any other subject in science. And because of some people's, critical reticence, we're not accepting that. But maybe this kind of conversation will help finally get us over that hump and maybe expose a little bit of reality that for so many of us has stayed hidden for so long.
As long as you brought up Dean Radin, ask him to tell you what the significance of a 5 sigma detection is in physics. In theoretical physics and experimental physics, a 5 sigma deal is a discovery. That's how the Higgs boson discovery. Then ask Dean Radin how many of his research projects he ran until he had a 5 sigma result, and you'll find out it's every one of them.
Yeah, in fact, I just read Real Magic again, and he talks about 6 sigma. I thought it was, maybe it was 5 sigma, but a layer or a level of certitude that is shocking. And he also points out in that book that the whole idea of controlled experiments where you have the controls, and a lot of that comes from parapsychology because of the criticism that was leveled at early experiments. They got more and more stringent about their code of operations, and the results are still not accepted. So, I mean, at some point, there's a absurdity to the fact that we set up these rules for science, but when we come up with conclusions that don't fit our, preconceived notions, we're not willing to consider it science, which is ludicrous, obviously. Professor Zimmerman, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, and this sort of comes in with remote viewing and all that, is consciousness. And Chris mentioned it a little bit, and that seems like the place people have to land when they start taking UFOs seriously, that they have to sort of begin to, analyze and consider the role the human brain and the human mind thinks or is involved in perception, and also whether or not there's deeper layers that we're not, normally aware of. But on the consciousness front, can you sort of give us a little bit of some thoughts on what you consider consciousness to be? And is it a real thing, or is it something that we've sort of an epiphenomenon that people sort of make up in order to give themselves a sense of identity?
Okay, 24 words or less.
Yes, 2 minutes.
Well, look, I remember going to college in the 60s, and there was an ideological component to the education that was all about science. And the science had certain parameters about reality. And the stuff that didn't fit in there just get chopped off. And I remember kind of pushing back intellectually and personally against this, but it was there. Now, the background is the atomic bomb and then the hydrogen bomb. These are 2 of the most incredible technological achievements ever, especially the hydrogen bomb. So, and that this won the war, and the people who were in the education then, the people who had been in the Army in the 40s and so on, and now were professors, they were really into the importance of scientific technical research for U.S. defense and for technological innovation. Now, one of the problems with this is the way in which it has affected our understanding of human consciousness. We are now told that the brain is the seat of consciousness, and consciousness is something that arises as a result of stuff going on inside the brain, neural synapses and all this kind of stuff. But increasingly, people realize, many people who study this matter realize that this is just not enough. You can't explain it in this way. Consciousness is some people say David Chalmers is the most famous advocate of this position, a kind of panpsychism, that consciousness is really a basic feature of reality right along there with matter and energy. You might have matter, energy, and consciousness. Consciousness does not come from matter, energy. It accompanies them, arises with them in some sense. Now, this is a major shift. Chalmers called the consciousness the hard problem, and it's the most difficult problem in science today. In fact, Chalmers had a bet with Christoph Koch, a famous scientist at the in University of Washington who studies these matters, and the bet was made 25 years ago that by now science will have been able to explain that consciousness arises from events in the brain. Chalmers won. It hasn't happened yet. They haven't explained this yet. You can say that they're as far away now as ever, and they re-upped the bet 25 years down the road. So why does this matter? It matters because how are we to understand the nature of reality if we don't take into account phenomena that evidently is not limited to what happens in the brain? People who have near-death experience, for example, out-of-body experience, all kind of strange experiences, which do not seem to be related to the brain any longer. If the brain is perceived as dead on the operating table with flatline and so on, how is this continuing perception possible? You read about people standing, if they're up at the top of the operating room, up in the ceiling there, watching their own dead body and so on. But what are we to make of this? I think it is one of the problems is it cuts us off from the host of paranormal experiences that we have, and that people have all kinds of these experiences. Just think about it. It often happens in children. They seem to be more open to these things, but their parents, out of concern about what would happen to them if people discover that they had clairvoyance or one or another psychic ability, they said, don't talk about that. Or no, that was just a dream. You know, those little gray critters in your room floating through the window. No, that was, part of it is we have been enlisted to be the gatekeepers even for our own families. That there are certain types of things you're allowed to talk about and admit to, but other things you just don't want to admit to. Now, people are willing to talk about this stuff in surveys, though. I read a recent survey that like 80% of Americans not only believe in various kinds of paranormal phenomena, but have had experience with one or more of them. They've had telepathy, sort of a telepathy, clairvoyance. They've seen a ghost, this, that, or the other thing. And this is so common that, and this is what Matthew was getting at earlier, we just have to own up to the fact this is not abnormal. This is normal. And what's abnormal is unwillingness to talk about it. Absolutely. Now, I want to there's so much to say about this. I want to end, though, with this reference to a series of books written by Artie Six Killer Clarke. Have you heard of her?
Absolutely.
She's a brilliant social scientist, Native American background, and I think she's situated in Montana. I think she's retired now, an educator. But she went she used to go all over the states in connection with her professional work in various kinds of higher education, curriculum building, and so on. And along the way, she started collecting stories from Native Americans about their UFO encounters. And I think there are 5 volumes of this, including one from Central America when she went down there. And these encounters they have with the sky people, basically, coming down here, they're full of all the same kind of stuff that characterize our encounters. There's lots of strange psychic aspects to the whole thing. They typically don't have a spaceship concept of it, although they show up sometimes as saucer-like and so on. But this is a very old tradition, Native American lore, long before white people showed up or Kenneth Arnold or whoever. This is part of their understanding of reality. They just took it, they have taken it for granted, as has every other civilization in history, that the world has all these different layers. You can see it in the New Testament when St. Paul talking about the principalities and powers That, you know, we're
Human
not
being, right?
fighting this. It's not just flesh and blood we're dealing with. We have to cope with these entities, including this, you know, the devil and these strange beings from other levels of reality. Now, that's one way. That's how they were talking about it then. Other peoples had their own form of discourse. Middle Eastern people, Arab, the people who followed, who are followers of Islam, talk about the jinn, where we get the word genie. And these are kind of strange trickster beings who show up. And I mean, anyway, the lore and history of our cultures around the world are loaded with this type of experience, and that these strange type of entities who show up as objects of such experience. And it's time that, let's put it this way, we have to grow up. We have to grow up. We've been behaving like children. We don't like those things to go bump in the night. I don't want to believe that guy was abducted by this, or this person who saw Bigfoot, or that gal who whatever, right? Let's not talk about that. That's behaving like a child. And I think it's time we stand up and say, enough of that. We have to grow up here and face what's happening here. And some of it's pretty dark. It's not all light and positivity. And that we have to take ourselves in hand and say, look, let's grow up as a society and support those who come forth and find ways to articulate what's happening in as sophisticated a way as we can. And I would go back to, Matthew, what you said in that wonderful Netflix show. They were interviewing you, and you were saying, look, this is not a matter for the physicists. It's people in the humanities, religious studies, philosophy, priests, and whoever, psychologists who are more important in a certain sense. Yes, we need the physics and so on, and the astrophysics and the telescopes and various types of vector readings and so on. But that's where it seems to me where it has to, our attention has to be taken to growing up as conscious beings and taking charge of our future.
Well, on that note, Matthew, can you give us a little sense of, I mean, we talked about your anomalous experiences and how they transformed your life, but your book describes sort of growth, the spiritual growth that you go through. And what did you learn through your experiences about human consciousness? And what do you think our species needs to realize before it's too late? After this, we'll go to Chris for some viewer questions, but yeah.
Wow, that's kind of an enormous question to try to answer.
Questions, I guess. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't even know how to answer that, honestly. I mean, it's this whole issue is just so complicated, right? And I am with Dr. Zimmerman. I think it's about time that we got back to teaching things like philosophy, religious studies. The social studies we teach is kind of a joke. You know, and I think that it's time to start getting back to that. Science just is not adequate in explaining this, and we've got to do better. But I think that moving forward, I love that we're having this conversation. I think it's productive, and I want to see more of that. And I personally have never needed anyone's permission to talk about this stuff, right? I mean, science may, kind of poo-poo the idea of the woo. I don't describe it as woo. I think it can be understood and comprehended in different ways that science is not going to adequately address these things, right? So I think that's why we need to get all of the disciplines involved in this, because science, you can't put an experience into a mathematical equation. You can't write an equation on the board and say, this is life, right? Because no, it's not. I don't experience life through a mathematical equation. And that is why science will never be adequate in describing this, because it's an experiential thing. Life is experiential. And I think that you can measure using science, you can measure certain things within that experience. But science has its place, right? The humanities need to inform science and not the other way around. That's just the way the universe is set up. It will never be the other way around.
Can I just add something to that? Now, I have never been really good at math. I mean, it was one of my dad was good at math. I just wasn't good at it. But I think it's important because you mentioned that if you go back to Plato and these people at the beginning, it was all about really mathematics. And if you're really good at math, it's a whole new language as a way of describing things. And I think it's, if you look back at the key players in the history of Greek philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, it was the kind of mathematics that helped open up this sense of alternative levels of reality. And so now, what I would say is mathematics, and perhaps especially math. I mean, not physics, but math. If taught differently, or if its history was put forth a different way, we would have a deeper appreciation for the importance of math as a way of disclosing dimensions of reality, which to those of us who are not math proficient are closed off from. And there's probably a way to do this, but I'm going to leave that to people who have some combination of mathematics and anomalous interest in the anomalous. Sorry, that's.
I was an English major, so I'm not one of them either. I did take college algebra, and for a little while, I got a glimmer of the enchantment that can come along with upper math, and it is a sense of you're encountering a whole different universe, and I kind of regret not having pursued it. Chris Avis, how are the comment section? How is it doing? And do you have any comments that you wanted to make?
Yeah, well, first of all, as one of the physicists on the panel here, I'll kind of weigh in and say, yes. Matthew, I want a bumper sticker with I don't experience life as a mathematical equation. And, you know, we have elevated the sciences to this point of reverence in our society. But as you talk about this and experiences, what occurred to me was just like, we talk about people's psychological shadows, and that there are these pieces that nobody wants to address because it's shameful. Phenomena is basically slapping us in the face and saying, try and explain this, you know, and maybe that is, Jacques Vallée talks about a kind of a control system. Mm-hmm. This is maybe something that is trying to force us to have these paradigm shifts. And I think it will be deeply ironic if it turns out that there is something to some of these elements of belief systems, things in the occult or in religion that we have moved beyond in the secular age. I think about like Newton back in the day, who was dabbling in some of these kinds of alchemy and things, but that's kind of shunted off to the side as a, yeah, let's ignore that. Let's talk about the Principia Mathematica instead, So it's going to be a very interesting thing, because it does feel in a lot of ways that we are being primed for a paradigm shift, particularly when you look in the realm of consciousness research here. In terms of the chat, first of all, I want to give a shout out, I forgot to do so at the head of the show here, to folks from the UFO rabbit hole community who are joining us there on the chat. I love seeing intermingling of these different communities in the spaces there. So it's lovely to see you folks. I'm going to open up with a question that I think everyone might be able to weigh in on, and we can see if we can get some other ones as well. One of our audience members asked, what are we to make of experiences with the phenomenon running through families? And I wonder if panelists can weigh in perhaps about this genetic connection and see if they have their own interpretations of what that means there. So see if anyone wants to take a crack at that one.
I'll take a go at it.
All right, Kelly.
I don't think we talk about it enough. I don't think this is the part of, like, we pay a lot of lip service to listening to experiencers and taking those narratives seriously. And if we do that, the abduction narrative, and not just the abduction narrative, but like contact encounters kind of across the board, very often, as a matter of course, have like a highly sexual nature about them. There's, lots of accounts of, genetic material being harvested and people seeing, entities that look like maybe they're somewhere in between a human and, something else. And, people having the sense or being shown children of various types that they have parented. And these are really tough things to talk about. And this is the stuff that, like, no matter how many times, Luis Elizondo goes on 60 Minutes, it's still going to be really hard to have these conversations at the dinner table or in like polite society. Like, this stuff is just really difficult to talk about. But it seems to be a really big part of what's going on. Of the abductees that I'm fortunate enough to be friends with, I know that like it running in families is just a matter of course. That's something that seems to be, the rule and not the exception. And we don't have a good answer. We can make a lot of guesses, right? And there's certainly plenty of content in the lore about what this might be about or what the purpose of it is or who even's behind it. But the truth is we have no idea. And we can't even begin to ask that question until we're just able to take seriously the facts as they stand and to not get squeamish about the stuff that like freaks us out and is weird to talk about. And so I love seeing that question. And I hope it's a question that we as a community become better able to ask.
Well,
Absolutely. Anyone else? I'd like to hear another take on it if somebody's got. Well, Michael, obviously you talked a little bit about your family connections,
right.
and it strikes me that, I mean, you said you had 7 siblings, I believe it was, or and 4 of them have had some sort of anomalous experience.
Post-war Catholic family. There were a bunch of us. Back then, it was great. I mean, everybody had big families, and we had always had plenty of kids to play with. But my little brother John was 10 years younger than I was. He's the one who apparently was abducted, my parents used to find him out in the hallway at night, in the middle of the night, looking out the window, and he was evidently seeing. One time he said he saw Santa Claus with reindeer or something like this, and he was so adamant about it. My mother. Now these are things and when you're a big family, you don't hear about everything. Some kids know stuff that you see. I didn't anyway, but apparently my mother, she knew that he had seen something, and she told Dad, said, "Look, he saw something. We don't know what it was, but he was always sort of fey. I mean, he had these access in some ways to things, but." I just don't know what to make of it. When my sister and my brother both had this experience of this shaft of light, the middle of the night coming through the bedroom window, and there's no way that it was anything human. In fact, in my brother's case, he was on the 3rd floor of Army housing in Germany, and outside the window were fields, and it was 2 a.m. or something. I mean, and he was awake. And here's a guy who ended up with a PhD in mechanical engineering with a dissertation on thermodynamics. I mean, I take that to be challenging. Pretty smart guy, right? And he was terrified. He just couldn't believe that this could happen. But both of them ended up as quickly as possible going back to sleep. Now, in my citing of that cover on communion, I was Whitley Strieber's book, Them. I know you might have seen this. It came out a couple of years ago. It's a very good.
Yeah, absolutely. Great book.
Yes, and one of the reasons why it's so good is he never really comes down finally and says X, it's X. He goes pretty far, but then finally sometimes pulls back and says, it's really a mystery, even though they're horrible. And I don't know what to make of it all and so on. But one of the things he says, and in connection with the face, he says, is this something that is very common, but not remembered? When I was, abduction, when I was at John Mack's, program for extraordinary experience research, he had Lawrence Rockefeller had given him some money, so he had a building and rented a place. Anyway, he had 3 massive filing cabinets full of letters he had received. Whitley Strieber got more than 300,000 letters, all of which his wife Anne read, and about which he said, this has something to do with what we call death. All right. Now, I sat down one afternoon and read a whole long file full of these letters. All right. Now, this is back in the day when it wasn't like shooting off an email. I mean, you had to sit down and write. typically people, not everybody even had a typewriter. Then you had to find the address, get an envelope, put it in there, put a stamp, and there was a process. And I read hundreds and hundreds of these letters, very few of which had anybody involved with hypnosis. This is their recollection. People who didn't have a strong enough recollection may not have written, but they were so honest and searing and painful. The shame, the uncertainty. And Kelly, I think what you're getting at is really important. It's about sex, reproduction, and children. I mean, the most private and primal aspect of the human. What is more primal? I guess food is pretty primal, but next it's sex, okay? And reproduction and the attraction. Plato talked about this. The universe is run by eros, by attraction.
Exactly.
That's how everything works. If we're attracted. And so the fact that this phenomenon is so tied up with these deep aspects of the human, it's such a violation and yet such a mystery that I don't know why this isn't on the front page every day. Except, as Kelly, you would, I suppose, point out, that we're all it's just too queasy for us. So it's just too threatening for us to handle this. I'm reading a book right now by Steve Aspen called Out of Time. He's an experiencer from England. And his account of the process, the phenomenology of the whole thing is very impressive. And his family experience, going back at least to apparently to his great-grandmother. So what does this mean, and why isn't this the topic? I mean, the flying saucers measuring their speed and, their amazing right turns, and it's been going on for 70 years, and hey, it's all great. But what more important thing is there for the human species at this point than to get some kind of handle on what seems to be happening to thousands, maybe millions of people? That has to do with our sexual reproduction and the beings that seem to be created by us in some kind of hybrid program. I mean, of course, it sounds completely preposterous, but except for the fact that I read all those letters. I don't know that I've been abducted, but I was really struck by these letters. These people had something happen to them that was profound and shaking, and sometimes revelatory, sometimes transformational. But as I was talking to someone who was where was I reading about this recently? Oh, it was from Brenda Densler, who wrote Lure of the Edge. She gave the plenary address at the Society for UAP Studies on Friday, or maybe I guess it was maybe Saturday. But anyway, one of the things she points out was that abductees or experiencers sometimes report that they're back in the 50s and 60s, especially warnings against nuclear war. And then in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, concerns about the environment. Okay, nothing about human health and well-being. Nothing about there's a lot of stuff on our plates as human beings that might have also been brought up. But these two issues are issues that may affect entities that somehow share the planet with us, existing in some plane that is biological in some way, but inaccessible to us. Except when they're willing to show themselves in some way. The idea that they're from other planets and galaxies, it's possible, but it seems unlikely. It seems to be more about planet Earth, especially since they can apparently reproduce with us. I mean, somebody from Zeta Reticula, it's unlikely they could. Anyway, you get the picture. But Kelly, you're right. I mean, this is the big shebang, and we got to get on this.
Science Bob, I mean, do you have any thoughts on this? And I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about paradigms in science, and if you've noticed that there's been a shift to sort of accommodate some of this information. I mean, a lot of it's shocking and unsettling, but has there been any kind of beginning evolution where there might be some acceptance of this in the halls of science?
Yeah, there's quite a few conferences going on now, publications being done. I want to point out that a friend of mine, Michael Masters, who is an anthropologist, recently published a paper on cryptoterrestrials with two people from Harvard.
Yes.
So, and that was accepted in a peer-reviewed publication. So I also want to go back to something Michael said, was talking about earlier. I want to point out that Donald Hoffman, who is a cognitive scientist out in the University of California,
Yeah.
is published many, many papers on kind of the foundations of consciousness and what it means for a cognitive scientist. And he first showed us that based on the mathematics of evolutionary game theory, which governs how evolution works in our world, that people that are conscious cannot perceive reality. So in other words, all the way back from way before Christ to Greek, we had Plato's cave, and now we have a mathematical proof we live in Plato's cave. What's going on behind us is all of the universe, but all we see of it is the shadow on the wall we're facing.
Yeah.
So our senses do not perceive reality, and evolution selects against any entity that perceives reality. So that all our senses do is optimize our ability to survive and procreate. They serve no other purpose. As far as evolution is concerned. That's number one. And number two, he's extended his work now. It's not yet widely accepted, but it is a foundation that consciousness and information are the basis for the universe.
Yes.
And he's begun to derive physics with others from that assumption that he has a definition of consciousness and a mathematical structure for it, and believes he can derive all of physics from it. That is a massive shift in the view of space-time is where everything happens, that, including physics, to no. Consciousness and the information that's in it gives us space-time where everything else happens.
Yeah.
So it's just a complete inversion where consciousness is now fundamental and all of physics is derivative. So this is happening all over the place. And of course, you have Dean Radin, who's just done a phenomenal amount of peer-reviewed research.
Yes.
I mean, doing things like showing that people's consciousness can impact quantum mechanically generated random number generators to extremely high significance. So yes, there is resistance in science. I've had people call me cuckoo for seeing UFOs and believing in stuff. And I was the chief scientist of the best funded research center at Virginia Tech. But some believe and some don't. Some support and some are against. So it's changing. It's not all the way there.
And that's what the sort of patient work that we're kind of involved in. I wanted to throw a question at Chris and also maybe Kelly. I mean, we've kind of touched on this a little bit before, but I mean, like, how do we begin to have a global conversation about this with all of this complexity and some of this horrific detail that people are not going to be comfortable talking about? I mean, that's just your run-of-the-mill people, not people in religious institutions who have a vested interest in kind of skewing this conversation, or people in science who may have materialistic training that doesn't allow them to even consider consciousness as a primary filament of reality. How do we begin to bring this out of the shadows in a way that's that allows for a complete conversation? Is there a way, or is it going to be stepped where we talk about nuts and bolts and then something else and then something else? Chris, you want to take a shot at that, and then we'll have Kelly?
That's a juicy one. Well, first of all, I'm going to say that, like, I worry about our institutions. I worry that, academia, which is for at least this century, one of the things that we've kind of held up as the standard for truth, faith in that has been eroded. Look at, say, faith in science and in vaccines that have been questioned in the wake of COVID there. It's good to have some skepticism of institutions, of your government, of your academics, in order to have accountability. But I worry about what happens if you just knock the pillars out from it. And that's what really worries me about academia. If you do have catastrophic disclosure, and you've had folks like Neil deGrasse Tyson going out there and just basically saying it's a nothing burger, there's nothing here, what does that do to society if you remove all of these things that have been kind of holding up that? So I think it's incredibly important if we are to have a stable and functioning society and not some kind of catastrophic collapse of social norms that this start to happen. I do think that it's happening in kind of pulsed waves here. And if you look at guests that James have had on the show, I remember James Madden saying, 2017 with the New York Times article from Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal et al. Coming out, that unlocked it. And, it still takes a few years beyond that for people to feel comfortable enough to come out and talk about it. So I do think if we were to look back in 50 years' time, that you're going to see this kind of plateau and then a rise and a plateau and a rise. And I imagine Lou's book is going to be another event. If you ever get the Rounds-Schumer amendment passed, that'll be another piece until it. So I think some of this is happening behind the scenes. Paradigm shifts, although they seem to happen instantaneously, I think there's often a lot of groundwork happening overnight for that. So that's one answer there. For myself, one of the things that has kind of been empowering to me about this in terms of being comfortable with this is to look at the state of the world right now and to look at all the dominoes that seem ready to fall. I mean, like I'm a climatologist by training, and hey, folks, the world is not in a good place right now. Like we need to be taking action yesterday. You can look at geopolitical instability and a whole host of other things, the discourse in politics and the polarization, which just seems to be getting worse and worse. And that's been, for me, what's made me feel like I needed to come forward and talk about this, because this kind of thing is the one kind of thing that I could see that could actually cause a paradigm shift that is needed to start to tackle any one of these problems, a radical reframing of who we are as a species. So although it may be catastrophic, I kind of feel like business as usual is going to be catastrophic anyways. So maybe we do just need to rip the Band-Aid off. And in doing so, maybe that is what leads to the transformation that allows us to save ourselves. And if there is a reality to the phenomenon being in some way intimately connected to us, maybe this is doing it for a reason. So a bit of a rambly answer, but that's my take on it.
Oh, brilliant, man. Absolutely. Kelly, any thoughts about how we tell this story? I mean, you're doing it, right? I mean, your documentary is one aspect, so.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's something I've been thinking about a lot, obviously. And the docuseries is kind of our kind of first swing at what we feel like that might look like in media. I think what's really important, number one, is that I think that we can really lead with people's curiosity. Is that I think that sometimes we worry about getting this whole idea and this whole picture across to people, and like, how are we possibly going to do that? But there is sort of an emergent nature to what happens when people begin to engage with this subject, and the way that it kind of makes their minds work differently, and in some ways makes their reality work differently. And so I think in some ways it's not necessarily, we don't need to overwhelm ourselves by worrying about having the answer, but more that like the more that we can do to spread that spark of curiosity that sort of triggers that natural process in people that really happens in its own time and with its own logic in ways that like we couldn't possibly plan. It's like such a personal thing when people really encounter these ideas. I think that the best that we can do to just like facilitate and hold space for like those kinds of questions and people's own natural curiosity to take course, I think is a really great thing to do. And I think the other thing that we can do is really flip the way that we talk through experiencer narratives. I don't think it's enough that we just listen to experiencers, but we have to change the way that we have those conversations, because a lot of times when you see in like most popular media and most conversations that we're having in public, if we're having them at all about experiencers, as soon as somebody reports that something anomalous has happened to them, now suddenly like they are in the interrogation chair. And the thing that is being interrogated isn't just like what happened to them, but the entire content of their character. And if you've ever told a lie, then like you can't be trusted, right? But who could really hold up to that kind of scrutiny? And I think that that's kind of, we get stuck in that place. And I think that the better thing to do is to help people understand how often these things are happening and how, like we've been saying, how normal these things actually are, and to try to give people frameworks. So it's like, okay, so this person told us this, and this story doesn't make sense because, this person saw this and this person didn't see anything at all, and instead of questioning those people, say like, okay, like, what do we know? What can we go to, the data that we do have to help us understand new frameworks for like why it might be that somebody, like one person would report seeing it and someone else would see it differently. And so I think the more that we can do to present new frameworks and ways of thinking through these things, the better success that we're going to have in terms of making progress. And so, that takes work and it takes time, but I'm really inspired by how many people in this community are engaging in that work and who are, I think, like I said, this is an emergent phenomenon. And it's happening with all of us together at the same time. And I think it's a really cool thing to be a part of. And we're all lucky to be here so early.
Absolutely.
Kelly,
And I think, go ahead.
I love that answer, Kelly. And what I heard and the subtext of your answer was that this is almost like trauma informed. It's like
absolutely.
if someone's been through a sexual assault or they had PTSD from war, you don't cross-examine them. You make them feel validated and you make them feel safe. And that's because these people need to have that healing. And yeah, I see elements of our community. Hat tip to Kelly with your community and how you've created that safe space where we can have that. And maybe that's how it starts, is with safe people. So we need something like a safe space for experiencers.
That brings me to another question for Matthew. Sorry, Kelly, I didn't mean to jump on your gratitude there, but you've had some experiences that were out of this world when you were in the Navy, and you were sort of a part of the gimbal situation as it unfolded. And you're someone who has been involved in that kind of thing, may or may not have had trauma, and then had the government come along and say, that's all secret. Like, you cannot talk about this aspect of it or that aspect of it because you're under, strict codes of secrecy or whatnot. How does that complicate your own journey of, synthesizing or working through what you may have witnessed when you have government rules dictating precisely what you can talk about and what you can't?
Right. Yeah, it does complicate things in that, I can tell you that the things that I've experienced and the things that people talk about every day are kind of mild in comparison to some of the things that I'm aware of from, behind closed doors. So it does complicate things because people do know this stuff, right? They know it and they're not talking about it. But everything is out there already. So in some sense, I can talk about it without talking about it, because it's all already out there. People know, we know that there are experiencers. We know that these things are happening. So that's very easy to do. But I also want to get back to what you guys were talking about earlier, in that something that I have always enjoyed doing throughout my entire life, and I think that this is what I'm trying to sell people on, is that working on myself psychologically has been something that I have always loved doing. I have loved that, right? And I think a lot of people, if you start talking about this stuff in terms of trauma and in terms of working on yourself, that there's an audience for that. I think that people are really kind of starving to work on themselves because they really need to, given the state of things. But the thing that I want people to understand is that, in terms of like science and mathematics and all of that you have like these layers of complexity with mathematics, right? You've got simple addition and subtraction, then you've got multiplication, division, and then pretty soon you're talking about like tensor equations or something like that. And it starts to get a little wild. But I want people to understand that in terms of human psychology and in terms of philosophy, you also have those layers, right? And so we don't necessarily have a common layer in which we can describe these sexual experiences that everyone's having and what they mean, right? But as you start to go up those levels, things start to become clearer as to why that's happening and what it means. And I think that there are answers. I am a firm believer in the fact that nothing just happens out of thin air, right? And if some being that is in a craft, and it's in this craft that can go anywhere it wants to, as fast as it wants to, and yet it's having these kinds of experiences with you, tends to imply that there is a much deeper level to these things that we're not grasping, right? And on a much deeper level of actual reality, objective reality. And so that's kind of the thread you need to pull there, and you need to start following that in order to understand these things. So I think it is important to have the discussions, but it's also important to try and understand why these things are happening. Yeah. And not necessarily, I mean, I understand that there's people who aren't ready for this, and that they may feel like they've been victimized, but at the same time, we also need to dig deeper, right? We can't be ashamed to dig deeper into these types of things to understand actual objective reality on a much different level, where, you know, psychologically and spiritually and philosophically, we're basically doing tensor level mathematics with that, right? So anyway, that
Well, I mean, just to be clear, to point out, I mean, you basically argue in your book that the purpose of these encounters is perhaps to propel spiritual advancement or advancement of consciousness of the people who are experiencing them, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that's 100% the point. And I've been asked before, you know, is the phenomenon different than, you know, the kind of psychological experiences, or is the phenomenon separate from initiation? And, you know, if you read my book, it becomes pretty clear that the two, in my experiences, were exactly the same thing. Because, you know, I would have some thought that, oh, I'm tired of all of this. I don't know what's going on. I'm having these constant nightmares, constant visitations. It's too much, right? And I'm done. And yet then I'll have some non-human entity show up in my room that night and say, you know, don't give up, keep going, right? Keep digging, keep working on yourself, because you will get there. And so they are both linked. They're the same thing, in my opinion.
Matthew, and hearing you say that, you know, it almost feels like mythological, and the link is that initiation piece there. I'm reminded of Joseph Campbell and the monomyth, and the idea is that these stories, which we resonate with so much that it becomes the backbone of any popular movie these days, is something that we psychologically need to do. There's that quote from him where it says, "The cave that you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek." And so I love this idea of, no, your dragon is unique to you. You have to go into said cave and face it. And the only way to fail is to not face it. So I really hear that. I wanted to use this, if I can, to pivot to a question from the audience here.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
Which was originally aimed at Matthew, because I think you've had some guidance and some downloads here, but I'm going to open it up to everyone here. How should we think about anecdotes of folks that are being guided to knowledge? Or I'm hearing from people in the chat and from the panelists about the idea of receiving downloads. And also, what might this imply about free will? Do we have our own free will? Is this guidance from a higher form of ourself or from someone other? And wonder if folks can riff on that and what that kind of means to them.
I think that's an interesting question. I'd love to hear people's answers. And also, given what we know about the trickster nature of the phenomenon, that's a really important question. How can we judge the quality or the intent behind these downloads or the messages people receive? Is it coming from a trusted source? Not necessarily.
Well, can I go first on that?
Yes, absolutely.
Since you bring up the trickster, that's one of my favorite things to talk about. So in terms of all of this and how do you know what's real, I think when you're working on yourself, there's a good measurement, a good rule of thumb, right? And that is, who do you become on the other side? Do you become someone that's generative on the other side? Is that where you've headed with this, or are you kind of breaking down and turning to the drink or drugs or something like that? And I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb, just to kind of gauge which direction you're going with it. And in terms of the trickster, my thought on the trickster is that it's not that the phenomenon is the trickster. The phenomenon will show you things, right, in objective reality. They will show you things. Death is not final, right? Here's your dead relatives, and things like that. But then where the trickster comes in is you start to trick yourself, right? It's like, are you going to accept this as reality or not? And sometimes it will show you things that are false to kind of gauge, okay, we showed you this falsehood. Do you know it's false? Right? Can you tell the difference? And so that's where a sufficiently developed intellect comes in, and why that's so important. And a lot of that has to do with instinct. I won't get into the details of that. That's a much deeper conversation. But that's my idea of the trickster and the trickster phenomenon within this. It's you kind of tricking yourself, right? And in that too, there are a lot of people who, and I don't mean to bash anyone, but there are a lot of people who view themselves as a victim within this whole situation of abduction, right? And I kind of took the stance that, well, here's these entities with this amazing technology that we still can't figure out. And they're having these, they're directly, purposefully having these experiences with me, right? And so is this the worst thing that's ever happened to you, or is it possibly the best thing that has ever happened to you? And which way are you going to go with that? Where is your trickster? And so that's kind of how I gauge these kinds of things. But other people, may view them differently.
It sort of harkens back to Ray Hernandez's point about, like, we have that the experience of contact can be experienced initially, at least, as totally negative, but over time, if you keep to continue it, it can push you forward and ultimately evolves into a positive experience. And as part of their surveys that they did, over time, it seems like the vast majority of people who have had experiences found them overall to be positive influences on their life. But there are people who have had horrific abduction experiences and don't see anything positive out of that. And it's hard to know whether, hard to question people's take on their own experiences without any experiences myself to understand where they're coming from.
So in my case, the downloads, the analogy I would use is my parents in front of me trying to instruct me. My teacher is in front of me trying to teach me how to do math. My preacher's in front of me teaching me how I ought to live my life. It was similar. They told me things that I did not know how to do. And so I had to go work to figure out how to make what they told me, which I was sure was right. When you get one of these downloads, you're absolutely certain it's right. So, but in my case, I had to go out and figure out how to make it work. So to that extent, there's absolutely free will. I could have said, screw it, I don't feel like fooling with it. Just like I do a teacher or my parent or my minister or whatever. It's so there is a lot of free will allowed. And the trickster, come to my house and watch it unplug my TV 5 times a week, or things like that. Knock stuff off of shelves. It just happens all the time. So the trickster is real as anything else. as the sun comes up, the trickster is real.
Yes, absolutely, Michael.
You know what, Matthew, you were talking about, and the trickster thing. Yes, I mean, it's all this stuff. There's too many things, but one of the what you're talking about there is discernment. How can you discern what's going on here? Now, you know, the discernment takes experience, and that's part of the problem with the whole abduction phenomenon. For one thing, the experience is often incoherent. It's partial. It's even the sequences are uncertain, and moving from one place to another, there's no transition. You're going through the window. The next thing you know, you're in this kind of chamber. How did that? And so on. And so there's a saturation. This is one of the things that was talked about in our humanities conference that was part of the USAP meeting over the weekend. There's a saturation that takes place in some of these experiences where it's very difficult you can't navigate. You can't quite understand what's happening. Now, it may be that you can learn how to do this. And then, in other words, is staying present better. Then I think of developing yourself and so on, as we were talking about earlier, the importance of that. I mean, I did long-term meditation. How do you call them? I did a 7-day Zen session. Check this out: 16 40-minute meditation sessions every day for a week. Now, this is a isolation tank kind of thing. It's John Lilly, but you're not in the water, and you encounter incredible. I mean, incredible experiences when you're willing to undergo and be with the pain. The deep teaching of those meditation experiences, those long meditations, is that you have to learn to embrace the pain, because it's through the pain that you get through to the other side. You can't hold it off. You have to let it in and it totally overcome you. And then the doorway opens to a whole other dimensions. I don't know how to describe it. But it takes some time to do that. I remember in one of these early long meditation retreats, it was the Zen one, I think. The pain was so bad in my knee. And you're in a Zen retreat, if you move, you might as well go home. You can't be shifting around on your cushion, baby. You just have to and hold it. But as long as I resisted, I was exhausted. And I thought that if I felt it, I'd be dead. But that didn't happen. It was a completely different thing. It was a total suspension of time. Time vanished. There was only the moment by moment intensity, which itself had no meaning. It didn't have pleasure or pain. It was just very intense. And as long as I could be with it moment or moment, then I was in a different world in some way. I don't know how to describe this. And if you go deeper, you enter into these levels of reality and so on. But how do you keep your wits about you? There, I think what Chris was talking about earlier, importance of working on yourself, meditating, learning to be present. And our society is anything but that. You know, the cell phone, the tweets, you finally got off Twitter. So, I mean, it's such a distraction-built society. The possibility for learning to be present is something that's uncomfortable or that's painful. It's being taken away from us. And that's not going to be to our advantage when we're dealing with these kind of bizarre phenomena that we're confronted with.
Absolutely. Hey, Chris, do we have any more viewer questions that you wanted to throw out to the discussion?
I don't think we have too many that I could pose to the whole panel. So feel free to shoot over to one if you've got one, James.
Yeah, I want to talk about politics, and I was hoping to kind of round out the conversation with that. And I was going to start with Bob, because I know he's known as being a political pugilist a little bit on Twitter. But given the presidential election Do you see a role for the UAP topic in that debate as we have to choose between Kamala and Donald? How do we insert this in the conversation? Is it appropriate to do so when we're still obviously so conflicted about how we're going to talk about it?
Well, look, the country's really, really split right in half. Even after Kamala came back and she's pulled back from where Biden was, she's pretty even. So we don't know how it's going to come out. But what we do know now, given multiple sources, is that the last 4 presidents were briefed, including Donald. So they know, just like Grant Cameron's been telling us for 20 years, if X is a president, they've been briefed. So and of course, the entire executive branch answers to the president. So they have a big role to play. And my now reading of the things that we are being told is that it was a PAED, kind of finding by a president that started the legacy program and then kept it secret from Congress and everyone else. That was an executive branch decision done around Truman or Eisenhower, one or the other, probably Truman. And so it's just kind of gone on and on and on. And even though things have changed, it still resides in the executive branch. Whoever the president is the ultimate classification and declassification authority. And they are given their clearance and this power by virtue of being elected. They have no other prerequisite. Once they are elected, they are the god of classification, so long as they are in office and until they leave it. So yeah, it matters. Whoever you think, if disclosure is your life, pick who you think will do best.
That's interesting, though. I mean, Donald Trump's already had a shot, right? I mean, if that's your issue, we know what he'll do because he's done it. And we're not sure what Kamala will do, although she said some intriguing things in interviews about she's got some interest in the topics that were mentioned, and UFOs and UAPs were one of those. So she may come in as an outsider, and it would be interesting to me to see how she deals with the subject. I think she's primed to take it easy.
Biden's been in the Senate et cetera for 50-something years, and he hasn't decided to release it.
Yeah.
So
I wonder
there's stuff going. Look, I believe that once you are elected to the presidency and you see the enormity of it, you realize that what's some of all this secrecy about, and I think one of the main things is they're deeply worried about the impact on the institutions of government that we absolutely need to survive in the modern world. And they're worried about damaging them to the point that they no longer are protective of our national security because they're damaged. I think that's one of the fears.
Chris.
As folks respond to this question, I wonder if I can add a layer onto this. We do hear, from folks in the community that, there's potentially up to as many as 40 whistleblowers that are getting ready to testify before Congress, that there are some machinations going on behind the scenes. Recently, there was Matthew Pines, who is kind of an intelligence specialist, and I think has a few more deep connections than many folks in the community, has intimated that it does really feel as though something is coming down the pike. This has already been probably the wildest run up to an election, certainly in my lifetime. I wonder if we can think about if something catastrophic or significant gets dropped into this election cycle, how can folks in this community pick this ball up and run it forward, either at a grassroots level or in talking to our friends and family about that? Is there a way for us to seize the momentum if something else unexpected comes out, maybe even depending on how imminent and Lou's book plays out, just to add on to that discussion?
Right,
you want to take a shot at that?
Congressman, tell them what you want. All in writing.
Amen.
They and their staffers take that into account.
I feel like I have the unpopular opinion, which is I don't know that the presidential election could possibly have anything to do with where we're headed. I think that speaking of uncomfortable conversations that we don't want to have, if we are to take David Grush at his word, if what he is saying is even just mostly materially true, then the situation that we're in is that a rogue faction or factions within the intelligence community has taken possession and has had for a long time possession of asymmetrical, paradigm shattering technology. They are apparently overseen by no one, and they're accountable to no one. And they've figured out how to fund something that's beyond anything that we could imagine, without really being detected and without having to answer to anyone for that. And so I feel like that's a reality that we continue to like not engage with as a community. Like we talk around it and we act as though, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be trying to do what we can in Congress, or that we shouldn't be trying to push our representatives about this stuff. Like obviously we should, but at the same time, I have the hard time believing that like, you know, we're going to pass some legislation and then these like rogue people who have no reason to answer to anyone are going to be like, oh, you got us. Like, I guess we're going to have to tell you what's really going on now. And like, I think that we don't pay attention enough to what's happened with our government, where we have 1.8 million people working in the government that, as we think of the government, right? Like what you learned about in 5th grade. But then there's 4 million, more than twice as many people who are working in classified programs, defense contractors, people who have like clearances in this like black part of our government. And everything about probably the 20th century and what's actually happened in the United States is a state secret. Like these aren't, we are, I think that we are very reluctant to engage with the reality of how little we actually know, and of the fact that like like I said, if we take David Grush at his word, a coup happened a long time ago and we don't have a democracy anymore. And so having this conversation about like, what is the presidential election going to do? In some ways, I feel like it's like we're comforting ourselves and we're not really talking about the reality of the situation. But that's just my like, my cynical view, I guess.
The upside to Kelly's contention is we'll know soon. They'll either tell us or they won't. And it won't be long before we have an answer. Because I guarantee you, I know a bunch of people and they are lining up to tell their story. They're going to blow it open. I mean, just go look at Ross Coulthart's interviews. He's now threatening out loud, I'm going to blow the door open if you don't go.
Well, you know, the other thing that occurs to me, and Kelly, first of all, I appreciate your candor on that and just being honest with this, is that any disclosure that comes from the government is going to be incomplete. It'll be framed on a certain view. It'll be redacted. It'll be this. I mean, the easiest piece would be just the nuts and bolts thing. There's a reason that people steer away from the bodies and whatnot. One of the reasons I think I'm so passionate about the experiencer piece is that this is something that is unredacted. It is weird. It's going to need people to parse it and help to make sense of it. But this is something that we as humans can take ownership on. And I think that can be a beautiful thing if handled correctly. So I love the community that is gradually coming out of the woodwork as these topics get more exposure. And maybe that's the second piece to this, is a parallel effort that hopefully brings in good-minded academics and scientists and some politicians, but not being so reliant on disclosure to validate the phenomenon, which seems to be what a lot of people are waiting for in the UFO community.
Well, there has to be, I mean, there is a sense that without the government coming forward and saying that this is a reality, a lot of people aren't going to know what to think. I mean, even if we talk about this more and more and the experiencer piece comes out, and I'm all for that, obviously, I think that people will increasingly get baffled until someone who they consider as having authority comes forward to say, it's okay to take this seriously. And I think Kelly's point is interesting. Like, since World War II, we became sort of infected with the fascist ideology of the cult of intelligence, and we ourselves have gone in an anti-democratic way, and we now have these rogue agencies who basically have very little accountability to the American people. They say they have accountability to the president, but I mean, that's not necessarily always true. The other thing is, the question that you had initially raised with me, Chris, is that how do we talk about these things and point out that there is this corruption possibly within the secret keepers of government without also tacitly endorsing QAnon and all of the other sort of the deep state stuff? Part of me wants to argue, well, there is a deep state, but it's not the deep state you're thinking of, and then that's just a meaningless quibbling that is just going to further confuse people.
This is called a rabbit hole, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks, Kelly.
Part of it is trickster, but I talk about accountability. The service, military service, has been most forthcoming about all this has been the Navy.
Yeah.
You'll notice that the Air Force is completely out of the loop. They never say anything. They don't reply to congressional inquiries. No generals show up, as far as I know, to take on any serious question. Part of it is, I think it goes all the way back to Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
You know, we at dawn we slept. The title of a famous book about Pearl Harbor. The Army Air Force wasn't ready. They weren't prepared for a sneak attack. And what we've been having since 1945, really, in this country, is constant overflights by UFOs invading American airspace, against which the Air Force is completely powerless. Now, this is a huge embarrassment and a source of major national security concern that they can't really talk about. So that's one reason the Air Force doesn't say anything, because they recognize that they're failing in this arena. Now, have you seen the new jets they have out there? The new Air Force stealth things? They look like those Kenneth Arnold craft, the kind of boomerang looking things. They don't have tails, the tail structure. They're flat. It's like they've got these UFOs in hangars and they're redesigning them for us. This is what we all hear about. But I think the unaccountability, failure to give any account of what is happening, it's a major embarrassment to this country that our U.S. Air Force is not saying anything about any of this matter. I don't know how to get them to come off wherever they are, but I acknowledge the Navy for its willingness at least to talk about this and to the things you saw on the gimbal and all that stuff and these craft you were on, Matthew. You all have been able to talk about this to some extent. But this lack of accountability isn't just pertaining to private contractors, Lockheed and whatnot. It also affects the Air Force. And this is a major issue, I think, that we really haven't tackled. Then I think about the Collins Elite, which was in that book by Nick Redfern, very disturbing read, about the extent to which there's a whole ideology within apparently a fair number of Air Force brass about what's going on. And it has to do with the theological interpretations of the whole thing, which for all I know may be valid. Now, let's face it, folks, we don't really know what the best interpretation of what's going on. But I think this is another example of the failure of accountability of a major aspect of our government.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the Air Force has proven itself to be sort of dodgy in responses to what the Congress has asked about. And again, that's an anti-democratic, like knee-jerk kind of reflex that is revealing a whole lot of problematic behavior in our systems. And somehow we need to get a handle on that and on the intelligence agencies and make them more accountable. But how do you even begin to have that conversation?
I don't know. We're doing it.
We're doing it. Yeah. Go. Did you have any final questions, Chris, from the chat?
I don't know. One thing I will make a final statement here, just because we're kind of opening up with the community. I think one of the things that our community can model is, on the one hand, open-mindedness, but on the other hand, critical thinking. And both of those are going to be so crucial, not just to navigating the UAP thing, but just navigating society in general. And much as I want to see someone coming forward with a tell-all with everything, we do need to be cautious. We need to look for evidence and try to model how to bring in these disparate threads. So I'm really hopeful that discussions like this that are open-minded, but are also demanding evidence and demanding corroboration, are things that we can kind of bring to the discussion. And hopefully, you know, as an educator, that's one of the things that I can impart to students, because as we move into this kind of AI dominated future where basically anything posted online could be questionable, we very much need those skills if we're even to make sense of realities. So I'm really grateful to everyone here for helping to that.
Do you have anything to say, Michael?
Just saying discernment.
Discernment, 100%.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, that's it. I think we're a little bit shy of 2 hours, but we lost a few minutes in the beginning with audio chaos. Thanks to my crew for persevering through that and getting us online. And thanks for a fantastic conversation. I think we covered just about everything that could possibly be covered in 2 hours. So thank you.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.